You know, I've been walking with Jesus for a long time now. Long enough to realize there are some things he said I thought I understood, but I didn't. There was a season in my life I didn't talk about much. On the outside, everything looked fine. I was still showing up, still saying the right things, still doing what people expect. But inside, there were things I knew God was asking of me, and I kept putting them off. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just quietly avoiding them. And what surprised me was this. It wasn't that I didn't know his words. I knew exactly what he said. That was the problem. Because the more clearly you hear him, the harder it is to pretend you don't. Over time, I started to notice something. There are certain words of Jesus we don't struggle to understand. We struggle to accept. We quote them. We nod when we hear them. But when they begin to touch our decisions, our habits, the way we hold on to things, something in us hesitates. And if I'm honest with you, there were moments when I heard what he said, and I knew if I took it seriously, something in my life would have to change. And I wasn't always ready for that. So tonight, I don't want to rush past these words. Let's slow down a little, not to analyze them like a lesson, but to hear them the way they were meant to be heard, personally. Because some of the hardest things Jesus ever said are not hard to understand. They're hard because they ask something real from us. And maybe that's exactly why we need to hear them again. Part 1. Follow me. It was never just about belief. You know, when Jesus said, "Follow me," it sounded simple, too simple, sometimes. But the more I've lived with those words, the more I've realized he was never asking people just to believe something about him. He was asking them to leave something behind. I used to think following Jesus meant you agree with him. You believe the right things. You stay in the faith. You don't walk away. But that's not what happened in the Gospels. When Jesus looked at Peter and said, "Follow me," Matthew 4:19, Peter didn't say a prayer. He didn't ask questions. The text says he left his nets. And I've thought about that a lot over the years. Because nets weren't just tools. That was his work, his income, his normal life. And Jesus didn't explain where this was going. He just said, "Come." And somehow, that was enough for Peter to move. Not because he understood everything, but because he trusted the one who was calling him. Now I'll be honest with you. Most of us, we don't mind Jesus walking with us. We just don't want to leave anything behind. We want him in our life, but we still want to decide how that life goes. We say we follow him, but we hold on to our nets, the things that make us feel secure, the things we don't want God to touch. And I've seen this, not just in others, in myself. There were times I knew exactly what God was asking me to do, not something dramatic, just something clear. Forgive that person. Let go of that habit. Be honest about that situation. And I delayed it, not because I didn't believe, but because I didn't want to let go. And that's when I started to understand something. Following Jesus is not about information. It's about movement. You can sit in church for years, hear every sermon, understand every idea, and still not take a single step. There's a story that always stays with me. The rich young ruler, Mark 10. He comes to Jesus. He's sincere. He's respectful. He asks the right question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And when Jesus answers, he doesn't challenge his beliefs. He touches what he's holding on to. Go, sell what you have, and follow me. And the man walks away, not angry, just unable. And I think that's one of the saddest moments in the Gospels, because nothing was wrong with his theology. But when it became personal, he couldn't move. So over time, I've learned to ask a different question. Not, do I believe in Jesus, but what am I still holding on to that keeps me from following him fully? Because following him always costs something. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's quiet. But there is always a letting go. And if nothing in your life is being surrendered, if nothing is being rearranged, then it's worth asking, are you following him or just staying where you are and calling it faith? Part 2. Deny yourself. Who is really in control? You know, This is the part people don't like to stay with for very long. Deny yourself. It sounds simple until it becomes personal. For a long time, I misunderstood that sentence. I thought it meant you give up a few bad habits. You try to be a better person. You say no to certain things. But over the years, I've come to see Jesus was talking about something much deeper than that. He wasn't talking about behavior. He was talking about control. Who gets the final say in your life? That's really the question, because you can believe in God and still live like you're the one deciding everything. I remember there was a time I was praying about a decision, nothing dramatic, just something I knew mattered. And I kept asking God to guide me. But if I'm honest, I had already decided what I wanted. I just wanted him to agree with me. And the longer I sat with that, the more uncomfortable it became. Because I realized I wasn't really asking for his will. I was asking for his approval. And that's a subtle thing. But it's a very real thing. Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Luke 9:23. We quote that verse a lot, but we don't always stop and ask, what does it actually look like? Because denying yourself is not about losing your personality. It's not about becoming passive. It's about stepping out of the center and letting God take that place. And I'll tell you where this shows up most clearly. Not in big moments, in small ones. When you want to respond, but you choose to stay quiet. When you want to hold a grudge, but you decide to forgive. When you could take advantage of a situation, but you choose what is right instead. Those moments don't look dramatic, but they are deeply spiritual. There's a moment in the life of Jesus that I come back to often, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before the cross. And he prays, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Matthew 26:39. Now think about that. Even Jesus expressed what he wanted, but he did not stay there. He surrendered it. And I've realized that's what denying yourself really looks like. It's not pretending you don't have desires. It's choosing not to let them lead. And if I'm honest with you, this is where following Jesus becomes very real, because it touches things we don't talk about. Our pride, our need to be right, our desire to be seen a certain way. And sometimes, God will gently put his finger on something in your life, and he won't shout. He won't force you. He'll just wait. And in that moment, you know exactly what this is about. It's not about the situation anymore. It's about who is in control. So over time, I've learned to notice something. Whenever I feel that quiet resistance inside, that hesitation, it's often not confusion. It's surrender. And that's not easy. I won't pretend it is. But I will say this. Every time I've chosen to let go, even when it felt small, even when no one else saw it, there was a kind of peace that followed that I couldn't create on my own. Not immediately, but steadily. Because denying yourself is not losing your life. It's placing it in better hands. Part 3. Love your enemies. When it feels impossible, Jesus said, "But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Matthew 5:44. Now, just sit with that for a moment. Not the idea of it, the weight of it. Because most people don't struggle to understand these words. They struggle to live them. It's one thing to love people who treat you well. But what about the ones who didn't? The ones who said things that weren't true? The ones who made things harder than they needed to be? The ones who walked away and left you carrying it? When that happens, something rises up inside, and it's not love. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, bless, do good, pray for them, it doesn't feel natural. It feels like too much. And maybe you've felt that tension before. You hear it, and part of you thinks, I know he said it, but I don't know how to live that. But here's something worth noticing. Jesus didn't say this because your enemies deserve love. He said it because of who you are becoming. And then you look at his own life, and suddenly, these words don't feel abstract anymore. On the cross, after everything that had been done to him, the betrayal, the mockery, the violence. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. That's not a teaching anymore. That's a life. So when he asks you to love your enemies, he's not asking you to do something he himself refused to do. But still, that leaves the real question. What does this actually look like in a life like yours? Because loving your enemies does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean calling wrong things right. And it does not mean you allow someone to keep hurting you. It means something quieter than that, but also much deeper. It means you refuse to let what they did to you shape who you become. It means you don't return harm for harm. You don't hold on to bitterness as if it belongs there. And that's not easy. Sometimes it feels impossible. But think about it this way. When someone hurts you, they've already taken something: peace, trust, rest. And if bitterness settles in, it keeps taking, quietly, over time. So when Jesus calls you to love your enemies, he's not asking you to ignore the wound. He's inviting you to be free from carrying it. And that freedom doesn't usually come all at once. It starts small. Maybe it's choosing not to speak about them the way you could. Maybe it's choosing not to replay the moment again and again. Maybe it's a simple prayer that doesn't feel complete yet. Not because it feels right, but because you know holding on will only take you deeper. And over time, something begins to shift. You don't react the same way. Not as quickly. Not as sharply. There's a space now. A pause. And in that space, grace begins to grow. So no, this is not an easy word from Jesus. It was never meant to be, but it is a true one. And if you stay with it long enough, it doesn't just change how you treat others. It changes what lives inside you. Part 4. Where your treasure is. What owns your heart? For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21. That sounds simple, until you stop and ask, what is my treasure? Not what should be, not what you say it is, what actually holds your heart. Because Jesus didn't say, where your beliefs are. He said, where your treasure is. That's something you can't hide for long. It shows up in what you think about, what you worry about, what you're afraid to lose. And sometimes it's not obvious until it's touched. There's a moment in Mark 10. A man comes to Jesus, respectful, sincere, morally upright, the kind of person most people would say, he's doing well. And Jesus looks at him and says, one thing you lack. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Mark 10:21. And the man doesn't argue. He doesn't push back. He just walks away, quietly. And the reason is given in one short line. He had great possessions. Now notice this. Jesus didn't say money is evil. He didn't challenge his morality. He touched what had a hold on his heart. And that's where this becomes personal, because treasure doesn't always look like money. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's security. A plan you've built, an image you're protecting, a version of life you don't want interrupted. And most of the time, we don't even realize how tightly we're holding it until God puts his finger on it. Not loudly, just clearly. Let that go. Trust me with this. Don't build your life around that. And something in us resists, not because we don't understand, but because we feel what it would cost. I've seen this in very ordinary moments. People who say they trust God, but can't rest when things feel uncertain. People who want to follow him, but only as long as it doesn't disrupt what they've built. And again, this is not about others. It shows up quietly in here. Because whatever you treasure, you will organize your life around it. Your time, your decisions, your priorities. That's why Jesus said it so directly. Not to accuse, but to reveal. So maybe the better question is not, do I believe in God? But, what am I afraid to lose? Because that question usually points to your treasure. And over time, I've come to see this. God doesn't always take things away, but he will often ask, can you trust me with this? And how you respond in that moment says more than you think. Because where your treasure is, that's where your heart goes. Not occasionally, but consistently. And if your heart is tied to something that cannot hold you, sooner or later, you'll feel it. Part 5. Why do you call me Lord when words and life don't match? There's a question in the gospel. That sounds simple at first, but it has a way of staying with you. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things which I say? Luke 6:46. That's not a complicated sentence, but it is a direct one, because it moves past what we say and goes straight to how we live. And if we're honest, this is where things get uncomfortable. Not in what we believe, but in the gap between what we believe and what we actually do. It's possible to say all the right things, to call him Lord, to agree with his words, to recognize what is true, and still live in a way that doesn't follow it. That's not new. It was already happening back then. There were people who listened to Jesus regularly. They heard him teach. They saw what he did. But hearing is not the same as following. And that's why, just a few verses later, he gives a picture. Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house, who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house, and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Luke 6:47-40. Notice the difference. Both heard, only one acted, and that's where this becomes very real. Because most of the time, we don't reject what Jesus says. We delay it. We hear something, and we tell ourselves, I'll deal with that later. I know that's true, just not right now. And nothing looks wrong on the outside. Life continues. Faith still feels present until something hits. Pressure, conflict, loss. And suddenly, what was built quietly is revealed. I've seen this in very ordinary ways. Someone knows they need to make something right, but keeps putting it off. Someone knows a pattern in their life needs to change, but it's easier to leave it alone. Not because they don't believe, but because obedience is always more personal than belief. And over time, I've come to see this clearly. Calling him Lord is not about what we say in a moment. It's about what we surrender over time. Because that word Lord, it means something. It means authority. It means he gets to decide, not just advise. And that's where many people hesitate. Not out loud, but quietly. Because it's one thing to listen to Jesus when his words feel comforting. It's another thing when they start asking something from you. So maybe the question isn't, do I believe in him? But, where in my life am I still holding the final say? Because whatever sits in that place, that's what you're really following. Part 6. I never knew you. The most sobering words. Rewritten. There's a passage people don't usually stay with very long. Not because it's confusing, but because when you really hear it, it leaves you quiet in a way that's hard to explain. Jesus describes a moment where people stand before him and begin to list what they've done. Lord, Lord, didn't we do this in your name? Didn't we serve? Didn't we build? Didn't we show up? And you can almost hear the sincerity in that. These aren't careless people. These are people who thought they were close. And then comes the part that changes everything. He responds, not by arguing with what they did, but by pointing to something deeper. In essence, he says, there was never a real knowing between us. That's the part that stays with you, because it means this isn't really about activity. It's not about how much you've done, or how visible your faith has been, or how long you've been around it. It's about whether there was ever a real relationship there, something lived, not just expressed. And if we slow down long enough, it raises a question most people don't ask often. Not, am I doing enough, but am I actually walking with him? Or just staying close to things that look like faith? Because those two can look very similar on the outside. You can be around scripture, around church, around ministry. You can even be involved in helping others and still keep a certain distance inside. Not intentionally, not as a decision you made one day. It just happens slowly, quietly, and after a while, that distance starts to feel normal. But you can usually tell the difference in the quiet moments, when there's nothing to prove, Nothing to show. No one watching. Just you and him. Is there something real there? Not perfect. Not impressive. Just real. Because over time, one thing becomes clear. A life that truly walks with God doesn't just talk about what it has done. It begins to show something different on the inside. Less need to prove. Less need to control. A little more patience. A little more honesty. A kind of peace that doesn't come from everything going right. It's not loud, but it's steady. So when Jesus speaks those words, it's not meant to push people away. It's meant to wake something up, to make it clear that being near him and being known by him are not the same thing. And that difference, as quiet as it may seem now, becomes very clear in the end. So maybe the question to sit with isn't complicated. Not how much have I done, but am I actually walking with him? Or have I just been staying close without ever really letting him in? Conclusion. After everything we've just sat with, maybe this isn't really about understanding more. Maybe it's about responding. Because the words of Jesus were never meant to stay at a distance. They were always meant to lead you somewhere. Closer. Closer than just knowing about him. Closer than just agreeing with him. Closer to actually walking with him. And the truth is, no one drifts into that kind of life. At some point, you choose it. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But honestly, maybe it's as simple as this. Letting go of something you already know you've been holding on to. Taking one step you've been putting off. Turning toward him. Not just in words, but in truth. Because Jesus never called people to admire him from a distance. He called them to follow. And through him, to come home. To the Father. Not as strangers, but as those who are known. So wherever you are right now, you don't have to figure everything out. You don't have to have all the answers. Just don't stay where you are. Take a step, because the one who called you is still calling